Let's look at an example. So it says write a program that creates an array of random numbers. Assume the array has an even number of rows, so that's important, and an even number of columns. Multiply the top left corner of the array by 2, the top right corner of the array by -3, the bottom left corner of the array by -4, and the bottom right corner of the array by 10. So before we do anything, we're going to start on paper. We're going to start with an example. Choose any size A that you want. It doesn't have to be A, that's just what I named it. And I'm starting with a 4 by 6. So I'm going to highlight the top right corner, the top left corner, the top bottom 2 corners as well. So here's my top left. I'm going to multiply this one by 2. Here's my top right. I'm going to multiply this one by -3. Here's my bottom left. This one's multiplied by -4. And then my bottom right, multiplied by 10. So now I need to go ahead and figure out how I'm going to actually modify this array with my code. So there's a couple questions we're going to ask ourselves when we write our code to modify an array. We have 2 sides to an equal sign. And here's some questions I'm going to ask. For my left-hand side, I'm going to ask, what do I want to change? Where do I want to store something? Am I trying to change a whole variable? Am I trying to change part of the variable? Which rows in that variable? Which columns in that variable? So if I look at A here, if I want to change this top left corner, it's A. I'm changing A, changing part of A, so I need to identify which rows and which columns. So which rows in this instance? Rows 1 to 2, and which columns? Columns 1 to 3. So that's for my left-hand side. For my right-hand side of my equal sign, I'm asking these questions. So I'm asking, what do I want to put there? Am I trying to put a whole variable or all the values in a variable? Part of the values in a variable? Which rows, which columns? So for this one, what I'm putting there is the same thing times 2. So it's going to be A, not all of A, part of A, rows 1 to 2, and columns 1 to 3, all of that multiplied by 2. And there we go. That's how I can go ahead and change that top right corner, or the top left corner of A. So before I move on to the other corners, let's go ahead and stop to think how this might change if A was a different size. So here is what it is if A is equal to a 4 by 6. Let's say A changed to a 6 by 10. Then I need to think about what would change. Okay, so for the top left corner here, for the rows, if A was a 6 by 10, if I had 6 rows, I would change rows 1 to 3. For columns, I would change 1 to 5. So that same thing would go over here, multiplied by 2. So then we're going to stop to think, okay, why? Why did I choose these numbers? I chose 1 because I'm always going to start at the top left. Rows top to halfway down. So the top is corresponding to row 1. This number here, I chose a 2 because it's half of 4. I chose a 3 because it's half of 6. So if I want to make this generic, it would essentially look like this. 1 to half the number of rows in A. So the number of rows divided by 2. For my columns, same idea. I start at 1 because I'm always starting at the leftmost column. And then this number here, 3 was half of 6. 5 was half of 10. So it's the number of columns divided by 2. And then that same thing goes over here times 2. So we're starting to think things in terms of generic. I don't have to necessarily for this problem because I'm not writing a generic program. It just says create an array. But I want it to work with any kind of array, any size array. I don't want to be limited to a 4 by 6. Let's go ahead and move on to this one. Move on to my top right. So my top right, which rows? Same thing, 1 to 2, but I don't want to say 1 to 2. I want to say 1 to half of the rows divided by 2. So number of rows divided by 2. Now which columns? Okay, so in this example, it's columns 4 to 6. 4 to 6. But I don't want to think about it in terms of 4 to 6. I want to think about it in terms of generic variables. So if I notice, this is half of my number of columns. So that means this is half plus 1. So it's the number of columns divided by 2 plus 1. And then why did I choose all the way to the 6, to column number 6? Because it's the last one. So it's all the way to the end. So if it's always going to be all the way to the last column or the last row, we can just use the end keyword. And what do I change that to? The same thing times -3. So there's my top. Here's my top left. Here's my top right. So now let's go ahead and move to the bottom. So to the bottom, which rows? It would be 3 to 4, but once again, I don't want to think about it in terms of 3 to 4. I want to think about it of why am I choosing a column or row 3? Why do I choose 4? So first things first, 4 is the end. I always want to go to the last row. This here was the rows divided by 2, which means this here is the rows divided by 2 plus 1. The number of rows divided by 2 plus 1. Did not leave no space, but that's great. Which columns? I'm talking about the first column all the way to number 3. Why 3 though? It's the number of columns divided by 2. Equals the same thing times -4. So here's my bottom left. And then let's do the bottom right. So if we look at the bottom right, which rows am I changing? It's going to be, once again, the number of rows divided by 2 plus 1 all the way to the end again. Which columns? It's going to be the number of columns divided by 2 plus 1 all the way to the end. Same ones we did for the top right. Was that equal? Same thing times 10. So each time we're asking ourselves, on the left-hand side, what do I want to change? Where do I want to store something? Am I trying to change a whole variable, part of a variable? Which rows in that variable? Which columns in that variable? And make them as generic as possible. Why do you choose the numbers that you choose? Is it always going to start at 1? Is it going to start at something else? Is it always going to end at 2? Is it always going to end at 3? Where do you get that information from? How can you make it generic? What goes on the right-hand side? Asking, what do I want to put there? A whole variable? Part of a variable? Which rows? Which columns? And then lastly, we have our logic check. Every time we do this, we need to check to make sure that the number of elements on each side, on this side and this side, that they're going to match and that they have the same orientation, same number of rows and same number of columns. If we look at this code in MATLAB, it would look something like this, where I've got some display in there as well, but I'm just going to create A with a random set of numbers. So this says a random set of numbers from 1 to 10 in a 4x6, and I display that. Okay, so here's what my old A looks like. Okay, and then I go ahead and I detect the size of A. I want it in 2 different variables, R and C. You can name them whatever you want. If you do rows, press Shift Enter to change all of them. C, maybe columns. So whatever you want to call those variables is the size of A. Okay, so the number of rows in A is going to be stored in row. The number of columns in A is going to be stored in column. And here's what it looks like. A, 1 to rows divided by 2, 1 to columns divided by 2. Was that equal? The same values times 2. Then I have A, 1 to the rows divided by 2, columns divided by 2 plus 1 to the end. Was that equal? Same thing times 3. And then here's my other 2 as well. And then I can display my new A. And there we go. I can check to see that it matches. So this number should be divided by 2, which it is. This number should be divided by -3. This number should be divided or multiplied by -4. This number should be multiplied by 10. And I can go ahead and change it. Let's say I have my 6 by 10. I can go ahead and run that. And I can see, oh, it does work. 9 divided times 2, 4 times -4, 4 times -3, 7 divided by 10. I can check to make sure that it works for multiple kinds of arrays. There we go. That's our first example.